The stagecoach rattled into Republic, Kansas on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, carrying a woman who would change everything Morgan Everly thought he knew about himself. Morgan stood outside the general store, his stomach twisted in knots that had nothing to do with the whiskey he'd had for breakfast. He'd done something desperate, something he'd sworn he would never do. After 3 years of struggling to keep his ranch afloat alone, after watching his hands leave one by one for better prospects, after eating beans cold from the can for the 100th time in a month, he'd finally broken down and answered an advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper. A mail-order bride agency, promising companionship and partnership for lonely frontiersmen. He'd sent his letter with shaking hands, included a bank draft that represented nearly half his remaining savings, and received a response within 2 weeks. Her name was Lorraine Nichols, the letter said. She was 23 years old, healthy and willing to travel west to marry a rancher. The agency had sent a small photograph, but it was so faded and unclear that Morgan could barely make out her features. Dark hair, he thought, perhaps a pleasant face. But honestly, he'd been too desperate to care much about appearances. What mattered was having someone to help with the ranch, someone to cook proper meals, someone to talk to in the evenings when the silence grew so thick he thought he might suffocate on it. At 27, Morgan had been alone for too long. His parents had died of cholera when he was 19, leaving him the ranch and a determination to make them proud. But determination only carried a man so far when he was working himself into an early grave. The stagecoach door opened, and the driver began helping passengers down. First came a traveling salesman Morgan recognized from previous stops, then an older woman visiting her daughter in town. Morgan's heart hammered against his ribs. Then he saw her. Lorraine Nichols stepped down from the coach with careful, measured movements. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and she carried a single worn carpetbag. But it was her face that made Morgan's breath catch in his throat, and not for the reason the romantic novels in his late mother's trunk would have suggested. A thick scar ran from her left temple down across her cheekbone, ending at her jaw. The skin was puckered and pink, still relatively new healing. Her left eye was slightly pulled by the scar tissue, giving her face an asymmetrical appearance. Another scar crossed her neck, disappearing beneath her collar. Her hands, he noticed as she gripped her bag, bore burn marks across the knuckles. For a moment, Morgan couldn't move. Not from revulsion, but from a sudden, overwhelming rage at whoever had hurt her. Because those scars weren't from an accident. He'd seen enough knife wounds in his time to recognize them. Lorraine stood perfectly still beside the coach, her chin lifted despite the way several townspeople had stopped to stare. Her eyes, a remarkable clear gray, scanned the street until they landed on Morgan. She seemed to be waiting for him to reject her, to climb back on his horse and ride away. Her entire body was tense, prepared for abandonment. Morgan made himself move forward. Each step felt significant, like he was choosing something important without fully understanding what. When he reached her, he removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Miss Nichols, I'm Morgan Everly." Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady. "Mr. Everly, I apologize for any disappointment. The agency said they would inform you of my changed circumstances, but I suspect they did not." "They didn't mention anything beyond your name and age," Morgan admitted. He saw her flinch slightly, saw her grip tighten on her bag. "But I'm not disappointed. I'm pleased to finally meet you." "Was your journey difficult?" Lorraine's gray eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise flickering across her damaged features. "The journey was long but manageable. Thank you for asking. You must be exhausted and hungry." I thought we could get some supper at the hotel before heading out to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride, and the sun will be setting soon enough." Morgan gestured toward the Republic Hotel across the street, trying to keep his voice calm and welcoming despite the fury still burning in his chest at whoever had scarred her. "That would be acceptable." She glanced down at her bag. "This is all I have. I'm afraid I don't have much to bring to this arrangement." Morgan gently took the bag from her hand. "Neither do I, if we're being honest. The ranch is struggling. I can't promise luxury or ease, but I can promise you'll be treated with respect and kindness. That's something, at least." Something in her expression cracked just slightly. "That would be more than I've had in quite some time, Mr. Everly. Morgan, please. We're to be married after all. Morgan." She tested his name carefully as if afraid it might break. "You may call me Lorraine." The hotel dining room was modest but clean, and Morgan was grateful that Evelyn Martinez, the owner's wife, showed them to a corner table without staring too obviously at Lorraine's scars. He'd known Evelyn since childhood, and she was one of the few people in Republic with genuine kindness in her heart. They ordered beef stew and fresh bread, and for a few minutes they ate in silence. Morgan watched Lorraine from the corner of his eye. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as though she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. Her table manners were impeccable, suggesting an educated background. The scars on her hands made her grip the spoon awkwardly, but she managed with quiet dignity. "I should tell you what happened," Lorraine said suddenly, setting down her spoon. "You deserve to know what you're getting before we proceed with any marriage." Morgan set down his own spoon and gave her his full attention. "Only if you want to tell me. Your past is your business. It will affect our future, so it becomes your business as well." She took a breath, her scarred fingers folding together on the table. "I was engaged to be married back in St. Louis. My family owned a modest haberdashery, nothing grand, but we were comfortable. My fiancé was a clerk at a law firm, ambitious and charming, or so I thought." She paused, and Morgan waited patiently. 3 months ago, he came to our shop in a rage. He'd been let go from his position for embezzling funds. Somehow, in his mind, this was my father's fault for not lending him money to cover his debts. He had been drinking. Her voice remained steady, but Morgan saw her hands tremble. "He had a knife. He attacked me first when I tried to calm him. My father tried to stop him, and they fought." The oil lamp broke during the struggle. Morgan's chest tightened. He could see where this was going. The shop caught fire. "My mother and I managed to escape, but my father—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "He didn't make it out. My former fiancé fled. The authorities caught him 2 days later, and he's awaiting trial for murder. But that doesn't bring my father back." "I'm so sorry," Morgan said quietly, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "The fire destroyed everything we had. The shop, our home above it, all our possessions. My mother went to live with her sister in Ohio, but there wasn't room for me as well. I had these scars, which made me unemployable in any respectable position. No one wants to hire a woman who frightens the customers." Her laugh was bitter. "The agency was my only option. They said they'd find me a husband who wouldn't mind a scarred wife in exchange for my domestic skills. I assumed you were desperate enough not to care what I looked like." "You assumed correctly about the desperate part," Morgan said, "but you're wrong if you think I mind what you look like. I mind what was done to you. That's different." Lorraine studied him with those clear gray eyes. "You're a surprising man, Morgan Everly. I'm a simple rancher who needed help and didn't want to be alone anymore. You're a woman who needs a home and safety. Seems like we might be able to help each other. Even though I'm damaged." Morgan reached across the table, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and gently covered her scarred hands with his own. You survived something terrible. That doesn't make you damaged. That makes you strong. A tear slipped down her scarred cheek and she quickly brushed it away. The agency said we could have a trial period. If you find me unsuitable as a wife, you can send me back. And if you find me unsuitable as a husband, she seemed genuinely surprised by the question. I hadn't considered that I would have a choice. You always have a choice, Lorraine, always. If you want to leave, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. I won't trap you. Morgan squeezed her hands gently before releasing them. But I hope you'll give the ranch a chance. Give me a chance. We'll get married by the justice of the peace tomorrow, legal and proper. We'll work the ranch together, and we'll see where it goes from there. No pressure, no demands, just two people trying to build something good out of difficult circumstances. Lorraine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers touching the scar on her face in what seemed to be an unconscious gesture. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden and keep accounts. I can read and write, and I'm not afraid of hard work. That's more skills than I have, Morgan said with a small smile. I can rope, ride, shoot reasonably well, and I know cattle, but my cooking is terrible, my house is a disaster, and my bookkeeping is a mess. Then perhaps we do complement each other. Perhaps we do. They finished their meal in more comfortable silence, and Morgan arranged for a room for Lorraine at the hotel for the night. He would sleep at the ranch and return in the morning for the wedding. As he walked her upstairs to her room carrying her single bag, he was acutely aware of the curious stares from other guests. At her door, Lorraine took her bag and looked up at him. "Morgan, thank you for not sending me back on the next stage. Thank you for getting on the first one. I'll be here at 9 tomorrow morning. The Justice of the Peace is expecting us at 10. I'll be ready." Morgan rode back to his ranch in the gathering darkness, his mind churning. He'd expected a bride, yes, but he'd expected someone plain and desperate, someone who would be grateful for a roof over her head and not ask questions about his failing ranch or his loneliness. Instead, he'd gotten a woman with strength in her eyes and scars that told a story of survival. He'd gotten someone who'd lost everything and kept going anyway. The ranch house was dark and empty when he arrived, the same as it had been for 3 years. But tomorrow, it wouldn't be empty anymore. Tomorrow, he'd bring home a wife. The thought terrified and excited him in equal measure. The next morning dawned clear and hot, typical Kansas summer weather. Morgan woke early, did his chores, fed the horses and the dozen cattle he had left, and then did something he hadn't done in months. He heated water for a proper bath, shaved carefully, and put on his only good shirt and his father's wedding suit that he'd stored in a trunk. It was slightly tight across the shoulders now, but it would do. At precisely 9 o'clock, he tied his horse outside the Republic Hotel and climbed the steps. Lorraine was waiting in the lobby, and the sight of her stopped him in his tracks. She wore the same blue dress from yesterday, but she'd clearly spent time on her appearance. Her dark hair was neatly braided and coiled at the base of her neck. She'd tucked a few wildflowers into the braid, probably picked from the planters outside the hotel. She held a small bouquet of the same flowers in her scarred hands. "You look beautiful," Morgan said, and he meant it. The scars didn't diminish her beauty. They just made it different, more complex. She blushed, the color rising even in the scarred tissue. "You're very kind. You look quite handsome yourself." They walked together to the Justice of the Peace's office, a small building next to the courthouse. Judge William Morrison was a portly man in his 60s who'd been performing marriages and settling disputes in Republic for as long as Morgan could remember. "Morgan Everlie, as I live and breathe," the judge said warmly. "Heard you were getting married. Congratulations, son. Your parents would be pleased." "Thank you, Judge Morrison. This is Lorraine Nichols." The judge's eyes flickered to Lorraine's scars for only a moment before he smiled warmly at her. "Miss Nichols, welcome to Republic. Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Morgan and Lorraine stood before the judge's desk, and Evelyn Martinez and her husband Thomas stood as witnesses, having been summoned for the occasion. Morgan held Lorraine's scarred hands in his own and spoke his vows clearly. When it came time for Lorraine to speak, her voice wavered only slightly. "I, Lorraine Nichols, take you, Morgan Everlie, to be my lawfully wedded husband." They had no rings, but the judge didn't seem to mind. "By the power vested in me by the state of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Morgan, you may kiss your bride." Morgan saw panic flash in Lorraine's eyes. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, just above the scar on her temple. He felt her exhale shakily against his chest. "Congratulations," Judge Morrison said, shaking both their hands. Evelyn hugged Lorraine carefully and Thomas clapped Morgan on the shoulder. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding. Lorraine Nichols was now Lorraine Everlie, Morgan's wife. The ride out to the ranch was quiet. Lorraine sat behind Morgan on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her scarred cheek resting against his back. He could feel her trembling slightly, either from nervousness or the motion of the horse. The late morning sun beat down on them as they traveled across the open prairie. "There," Morgan said finally, pointing ahead. "That's home." The ranch wasn't much to look at. A modest two-story house that needed paint, a barn that needed repairs, a chicken coop that was more hope than structure, and corrals that held far fewer animals than they were built for. The land stretched out around them, good grazing land that could support 100 head of cattle if Morgan had the money to buy them. "It needs work," Lorraine said softly. "That's putting it kindly. It needs a miracle, honestly, but it's got good bones. My father built the house himself when he and my mother first married. Solid construction, even if it looks rough now." Morgan helped Lorraine down from the horse and showed her inside. The house was as bad as he'd feared it would be. Dust covered every surface, dishes were piled in the dry sink, and his clothes were scattered across chairs. The whole place smelled of bachelor neglect. "I'm sorry," he said, genuinely embarrassed. "I meant to clean before you arrived, but I ran out of time." Lorraine set down her carpetbag and looked around the main room with its stone fireplace, rough wooden table, and handful of chairs. "My father used to say that a house isn't a home until someone cares about it. This house hasn't been cared for in a while, but that can change." She rolled up her sleeves, revealing more scars on her forearms. "Show me where you keep your cleaning supplies and let's make this place livable." They spent the rest of the day working together. Morgan brought in water from the well while Lorraine scrubbed surfaces with a determination that suggested she was glad to have something productive to do. She opened windows that had been closed for months, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms. She washed dishes and organized the kitchen while Morgan cleaned out the fireplace and swept the floors. By evening, the house looked better than it had in years. Lorraine had even found his mother's curtains in a trunk and hung them in the windows, softening the harsh angles of the rooms. The smell of lye soap and fresh air had replaced the stale odor of loneliness. "I found some beans and salt pork in the pantry," Lorraine said. "It's not much, but I can make a supper if you'd like." "That would be wonderful. I'll tend to the animals and wash up." When Morgan returned from the barn, his hands and face scrubbed clean, the smell of cooking beans and cornbread filled the house. Lorraine had set the table with his mother's dishes, found candles somewhere, and created something that looked remarkably like a proper meal. They sat across from each other, this stranger who was now his wife, and shared their first meal in their home. The food was simple but good, better than anything Morgan had eaten in months. "This is delicious," he said honestly. "Wait until I have better supplies to work with. I can do much more with a properly stocked pantry." She paused, then added carefully, "If there's money for supplies, that is." Morgan appreciated her directness. "We have enough for necessities. Not luxuries, but we won't starve. I have some cattle that should be ready for market in the fall. If we can get them to the rail station in Salina, we'll have enough to get through winter and maybe buy more stock in the spring. Then we'll make it work." She said it with such simple certainty that Morgan found himself believing her. After supper, they washed dishes together in awkward silence. The sun had set, and the reality of their situation was settling in. They were married. This was their wedding night, and they were essentially strangers. "I'll show you the upstairs," Morgan said finally. "There are 2 bedrooms. The larger one was my parents' room. I've been using the smaller one. You should take the larger room. It has a better window and more space." Lorraine looked at him carefully. "And where will you sleep?" "The smaller room is fine for me, or I can sleep down here if you'd prefer." "Morgan, we're married." "We are, but I won't presume anything. You've been through enough without having a stranger make demands on you." He met her eyes steadily. "We'll move at whatever pace feels right for you. No pressure, remember." Her expression softened. "You're a very unusual man, so I've been told." He carried her bag upstairs and showed her the larger bedroom. His mother's quilt still covered the bed, faded but clean. Lorraine touched it gently. "This is beautiful work. My mother made it. She was good with her hands." Morgan set down the bag. "There's a washstand with fresh water. I'll be in the next room if you need anything." "Morgan," her voice stopped him at the door. "Thank you for everything, for not looking at me with pity or disgust, for treating me like a person instead of a burden. You're my wife, Lorraine. And I'm starting to think I'm the lucky one in this arrangement." He left her then, closing the door gently behind him. In his own small room, Morgan lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. He could hear Lorraine moving around in the next room, the soft sounds of her preparing for bed. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone in this house. And surprisingly, it felt right. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Lorraine rose before dawn to make breakfast while Morgan did the morning chores. They worked together during the day, Lorraine tackling the house and garden while Morgan mended fences and tended the cattle. They shared meals, conversation growing easier as they learned about each other. Morgan discovered that Lorraine had a quick wit and a love of books. She'd been well educated before the fire, and she missed having access to reading material. He promised to order her some books from Salina when they had the money. Lorraine learned that Morgan was quieter than most men, content to listen rather than talk, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful. He was patient with the animals, gentle with the horses, and never raised his voice in anger. They were still sleeping in separate rooms, still moving around each other with careful politeness. But something was growing between them, fragile and new. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after their wedding, Morgan came in from checking the cattle to find Lorraine in the garden she'd planted, pulling weeds in the intense heat. Her face was flushed, sweat dripping down her scarred cheek. "Lorraine, it's too hot to be out here. Come inside." "I'm almost finished." "You'll make yourself sick. Please come inside." She stood, wiping her forehead with the back of her scarred hand, and swayed slightly. Morgan was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. "I'm fine," she protested, but her voice was weak. "You're not fine. You're about to collapse from heat exhaustion." He half carried her into the house and settled her in a chair. He brought cool water from the well and a cloth, gently wiping her face and neck. His fingers brushed against the scars and he felt her flinch. "Do they hurt?" he asked quietly. "The scars? Sometimes. When the weather changes or when I'm very tired. The skin pulls differently than it used to." Morgan continued his gentle ministrations, wiping away the sweat and dust. "Tell me if I hurt you." "You're not hurting me. You're being incredibly gentle." She looked up at him, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "Why are you so kind to me? Why wouldn't I be? Most men would be repulsed. My former fiancé did this to me, and even before he attacked me, he never touched me the way you do. Like I'm something precious instead of damaged." Morgan knelt in front of her chair so they were at eye level. "You are precious. These scars don't change that. If anything, they show how strong you are. You survived, Lorraine. You kept going when you had every reason to give up. That's not damaged. That's remarkable." Tears spilled down her cheeks, following the path of the scar. "I don't feel strong. I feel broken." "Then let me be strong enough for both of us until you remember your own strength." He cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "We're building something here, you and me. Something good. I feel it every day. Do you feel it too?" "Yes," she whispered. "I feel it." Morgan leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When his lips touched hers, it was soft and careful, a question more than a demand. Lorraine's scarred hands came up to grip his shoulders, and she kissed him back with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Morgan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I didn't expect it to happen, but it is. I think I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I've already lost so much. I don't think I could bear to lose you too." Morgan pulled her close, holding her against his chest. "You won't lose me. I'm not going anywhere." That night, Lorraine didn't go to the larger bedroom. She stood at Morgan's door, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a white nightgown that had seen better days. "May I stay with you?" she asked softly. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Morgan pulled back the covers in invitation, and Lorraine slipped into bed beside him. He wrapped his arms around her, and she pressed her scarred cheek against his chest. They lay together in the darkness, listening to each other breathe, and for the first time since the fire that had destroyed her life, Lorraine felt safe. They made love for the first time that night, slow and gentle, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. Morgan kissed every scar, whispering against her damaged skin that she was beautiful, that she was wanted, that she was loved. Lorraine cried and laughed and held him close, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy again. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Lorraine traced patterns on Morgan's chest. "I never thought I'd have this," she said quietly. "After everything that happened, I thought this part of my life was over before it began." "What part?" "Being wanted, being loved, having a partner." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I thought I was signing up for a business arrangement, a roof over my head in exchange for domestic labor. I never expected to find love." Morgan tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Neither did I. I thought I was getting help with the ranch. Instead, I got a wife I'm crazy about and a reason to make this place successful again. We will make it successful. Together." And they did. Over the following months, Morgan and Lorraine worked tirelessly to bring the ranch back to life. Lorraine's careful management of their limited funds meant they could afford better supplies, which led to better meals and better care for the animals. Her garden flourished, providing vegetables they could eat and preserve for winter. She mended Morgan's worn clothes and made new curtains from old fabric. Morgan repaired the barn and the corrals, rebuilt the chicken coop, and managed to buy 3 more cows at a good price from a neighbor. He worked from dawn until dusk, driven by a new determination to provide for his wife, to prove himself worthy of her trust. They made a trip to Republic once a month for supplies, and each time, Morgan noticed how the townspeople's attitudes toward Lorraine shifted. At first, there had been stares and whispers, but Lorraine held her head high, never cowering or apologizing for her appearance. She was polite but firm, and gradually, people began to see past the scars to the capable, intelligent woman beneath. Evelyn Martinez became a particular friend, inviting Lorraine to join the church ladies' sewing circle. Morgan expected Lorraine to refuse, not wanting to subject herself to the gossip and judgment. But she surprised him. "I won't hide," she told him firmly. "I didn't survive what I survived just to become a hermit. These scars are part of me now. People can accept that or not, but I won't apologize for them." Morgan loved her even more for her courage. The sewing circle met on Thursday afternoons at the church. Morgan drove Lorraine into town in their wagon, promised to return in 2 hours, and watched nervously as she walked into the church with her chin held high. When he picked her up 2 hours later, she was smiling. "They were kind," she said, sounding surprised. A few were clearly uncomfortable, but Evelyn kept the conversation moving, and by the end, they were treating me like anyone else. "That's because you are like anyone else, just braver than most." Fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the time to drive their cattle to market. Morgan had 15 head now, not a large number, but enough to bring in decent money if he could get them to Salina. The problem was making the drive alone would be difficult, and he couldn't afford to hire help. "I'll come with you," Lorraine said when he voiced his concerns. "It's too dangerous." 5 days on the trail, camping rough, dealing with whatever we encounter. "I can ride, I can shoot, I can be useful." She crossed her arms. "We're partners, Morgan. That means we do the hard things together." So they drove the cattle to Salina together, Lorraine riding alongside Morgan, helping keep the animals in line, cooking over the campfire at night, and standing watch when necessary. She didn't complain about the hard ground or the long days. She just did what needed to be done. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire, Morgan watched his wife cleaning her rifle with practiced efficiency. Her scarred face was intent on the task, the firelight dancing across her damaged skin. "What?" she asked, noticing his stare. "I was just thinking how extraordinary you are." She laughed. "I'm filthy, exhausted, and I'm sure I smell terrible. That's not very extraordinary. You're out here on the trail, doing work most men would complain about, never asking for special treatment, just handling everything that comes your way. That's pretty damn extraordinary, Lorraine." She set aside her rifle and moved closer to him, settling against his side. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "You know what's extraordinary," she said softly. "Having a husband who sees me as an equal, who values my strength instead of being threatened by it, who looks at me and sees a partner instead of property or a burden. That's just common sense. It's rarer than you think." They sold the cattle in Salina for a good price, enough to see them through the winter and buy more stock in the spring. Morgan used some of the money to buy Lorraine a new dress, proper fabric for sewing, and 3 books from the general store. Her delight in these simple gifts made him wish he could give her so much more. On the ride back to the ranch, they stopped in Republic to share their good news with Judge Morrison and the Martineses. Evelyn insisted they stay for supper, and over roast chicken and potatoes, Lorraine and Evelyn chattered about the sewing circle while Morgan and Thomas discussed cattle prices and weather predictions. "You two look happy," Judge Morrison observed, having been invited to the meal as well. "Marriage suits you both." "It does," Morgan agreed, reaching under the table to take Lorraine's scarred hand in his. She squeezed back, her gray eyes meeting his with warmth and love. Winter came hard that year, with blizzards that trapped them in the house for days at a time. But those days weren't the lonely, desperate times Morgan remembered from previous winters. Now he had Lorraine to talk to read with by the fire, to hold close when the wind howled outside. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies completely, finding joy and comfort in their physical connection. Lorraine grew more confident, more willing to initiate contact, more comfortable in her own skin. The shadows that had haunted her eyes when she first arrived were fading, replaced by contentment and hope. One morning in late January, Lorraine woke feeling ill. She barely made it to the chamber pot before she was sick. Morgan held her hair back, rubbing her back gently. "Should I ride for the doctor?" he asked, worried. "No," Lorraine said, wiping her mouth with a shaky hand. "I don't think I'm sick, at least not the way you mean." It took Morgan a moment to understand. When he did, his eyes widened. "You think you're pregnant?" "My monthly courses are late, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings. It's too early to be certain, but yes, I think I might be." Morgan pulled her into his arms, mindless of the fact that she'd just been sick. "A baby. We're going to have a baby. Maybe. It's early yet. Many things can happen." But as the weeks passed and Lorraine's condition became more certain, they allowed themselves to believe. By March, there was no doubt. Lorraine's belly was beginning to swell and the morning sickness had passed, leaving her with a voracious appetite and renewed energy. Morgan became even more protective, trying to stop her from doing heavy work. Lorraine tolerated this for about a week before she put her foot down. "I'm pregnant, not fragile. I can still do normal tasks, but you shouldn't strain yourself." Morgan ever lie, "I will not spend the next 6 months sitting in a chair like an invalid. I will continue to do my share of the work, just perhaps a bit more carefully. You need to trust me to know my own limits." He did trust her, so he backed off, though he still worried constantly. They began preparing the smaller bedroom upstairs as a nursery, painting the walls with whitewash and building a cradle from wood Morgan had been saving. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle they'd bought with their market money arrived, along with a breeding bull. Morgan hired a young ranch hand named Timothy Cooper to help with the increased work. Timothy was 17, earnest, and didn't blink twice at Lorraine's scars. He became a valuable addition to the ranch, and Lorraine enjoyed having someone else to cook for. One afternoon in May, Lorraine was hanging laundry when a rider approached the ranch. She shaded her eyes against the sun, trying to make out who it was. As the horse drew closer, her heart began to pound. The rider was a woman, and she looked familiar. "Lorraine." The woman called out as she dismounted. "Lorraine, is that really you?" Recognition hit like a physical blow. "Mother." Catherine Nichols looked older than when Lorraine had last seen her 8 months ago, thinner with more gray in her hair, but it was definitely her mother. The two women stared at each other for a frozen moment, then Catherine rushed forward and pulled Lorraine into a fierce embrace. "My dear girl, my dear, dear girl. I've been searching for you for months." Lorraine held her mother tight, tears streaming down her scarred face. "How did you find me?" "I contacted the agency. They were reluctant to give me information at first, but I persisted. They finally told me you'd been placed with a rancher in Republic, Kansas." Catherine pulled back, cupping Lorraine's face in her hands, her eyes taking in the scars that had healed since she'd last seen her daughter. "Are you all right? Are you being treated well?" "I'm more than all right. I'm happy." Lorraine placed a hand on her swollen belly. "And I'm going to be a mother." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my darling, that's wonderful news." Morgan came running from the barn, alerted by Timothy that there was a visitor. He took in the scene of the two women embracing and slowed his approach. "Mother, this is my husband, Morgan Everlie. Morgan, this is my mother, Lorraine Nichols." "Pleased to meet you, madam," Morgan said, removing his hat. "Welcome to our home." Catherine studied him with a mother's critical eye, taking in his rough work clothes, his sun-weathered face, and the gentle way he looked at her daughter. "Mr. Everlie, thank you for taking care of my Lorraine." "She takes care of me just as much, madam. We're partners." The right answer, apparently, because Catherine's expression softened. They brought Catherine inside, and over coffee and cake, the older woman explained her journey. After Lorraine had left, Catherine had struggled with the loss of both her husband and daughter. Her sister's home in Ohio had been stifling, full of criticism and judgment. Catherine had saved every penny she could and finally had enough to come looking for her daughter. "I couldn't bear not knowing if you were safe, if you were happy," Catherine said, gripping Lorraine's hand. "I had to see for myself." "I'm both safe and happy," Lorraine assured her. "Morgan is a good man. He's never made me feel like I was anything less than wanted." Catherine's eyes flickered to Morgan, who was trying to make himself unobtrusive in the corner of the kitchen. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but Lorraine answered anyway. "I do, very much." "And you, Mr. Everlie, do you love my daughter?" Morgan met Catherine's eyes steadily. "More than I knew it was possible to love anyone, madam. She's the best thing that ever happened to me." Catherine nodded, satisfied. "Then I'm glad she found you, even if the circumstances that led her here were tragic." They convinced Catherine to stay for an extended visit. The older woman was delighted to help prepare for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes and blankets with skilled hands. She and Lorraine spent hours talking, healing the breach that distance and tragedy had created between them. Morgan liked Catherine. She was practical and hardworking, with a sharp wit that reminded him of Lorraine. She fit seamlessly into their household, helping with cooking and cleaning, giving advice when asked but not interfering. One evening, about 2 weeks after Catherine's arrival, Morgan found her sitting on the porch watching the sunset. He joined her and they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "She's happy here," Catherine said finally. "Truly happy, I can see it in her eyes. I try my best to make her happy." "You do more than try, you succeed." Catherine turned to look at him. "When I first saw those scars after the attack, I thought her life was over. I thought no man would want her, that she'd live as a spinster or a charity case. I hated myself for thinking it, but I did. She's beautiful, scars and all. You really believe that, don't you? It's not just words." "Of course I believe it. The scars are part of her story, part of what made her the strong woman she is. How could I not love them when they're part of her?" Catherine wiped away a tear. "I'm so grateful she found you, Morgan Everlie. You've given her back her life. She gave me back mine. I was just existing before she came. Now I'm living." The baby came on a sweltering afternoon in late August, almost exactly a year after Lorraine had first arrived in Republic. The labor was long and difficult, with Catherine and Doc Williams, the town physician, attending. Morgan paced outside the bedroom door, terrified and helpless. Finally, after what felt like days but was only 12 hours, he heard the sharp cry of a newborn. A few minutes later, Catherine emerged, her face weary but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy baby boy. And Lorraine is fine, tired but fine." Morgan nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see them?" "Of course." He entered the bedroom to find Lorraine propped up against pillows, looking exhausted and radiant at the same time. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets Catherine had made. Morgan approached slowly, in awe of the scene before him. "Meet your son," Lorraine said softly, pulling back the blanket so Morgan could see the baby's face. He was red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus. He was perfect. "He's beautiful," Morgan whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "He's so small. He'll grow." Lorraine looked up at her husband, her scarred face glowing with love and exhaustion. What should we name him? They discussed names for months without deciding. But looking at his son, Morgan knew. "Matthew, after my father. Matthew Daniel Everlie." "Matthew," Lorraine repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Matthew Daniel Everlie. Welcome to the world, little one." Morgan sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Lorraine, the two of them looking down at their son. Catherine stood in the doorway, wiping her eyes, watching her daughter hold her grandchild. After so much loss and pain, here was new life, new hope, new joy. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Matthew was a good baby, generally content, but he still needed constant care. Morgan and Lorraine worked together, taking turns with nighttime feedings, changing countless diapers and marveling at every small development. Catherine stayed through the winter, helping with the baby and the household, giving the new parents time to adjust. But as spring approached, she began talking about returning to Ohio. "My sister's husband has found me a position managing a boarding house," she explained. "It's good work, respectable, and I'll have my own income. I can't stay here forever as much as I'd like to." "You could stay," Lorraine said, though she knew her mother needed her own life. "We have room. You need your privacy, and I need my independence. But I'll visit often, and you must promise to write me every week about Matthew's progress." "I promise." They saw Catherine off on the stage in early April, all of them teary-eyed. Matthew, now 7 months old and growing rapidly, waved his chubby fist at his grandmother as if saying goodbye. Catherine pressed kisses to his fat cheeks and hugged Lorraine and Morgan tightly. "Take care of each other," she said. "And be happy." "We will," they promised. Life on the ranch continued to improve. The cattle herd was growing, and Morgan was able to hire another hand to help Timothy. The house was warm and full of life, with Matthew's laughter ringing through the rooms. Lorraine had never been happier, her past pain fading into memory as she focused on the beautiful present she'd built. One evening in late summer, almost 2 years after Lorraine had first arrived in Republic, Morgan came in from the fields to find her in the kitchen, preparing supper while Matthew played with wooden blocks on the floor. The sight of them, his family, made his heart swell. Lorraine looked up and smiled, the scar on her face crinkling. Morgan crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly. "What was that for?" she asked, laughing. "For being you, for being here, for making my life better than I ever dreamed it could be." "You've done the same for me." She cupped his face in her scarred hands. "I arrived here broken and afraid, expecting nothing. You gave me everything. Love, a home, a family. You showed me that my scars don't define me. They don't. They're just part of your story, and I love every part of you." Matthew made a demanding sound from the floor, clearly wanting attention. Morgan scooped him up, tossing him gently in the air and catching him. The little boy shrieked with laughter, his dark eyes sparkling. "He's getting so big," Morgan marveled. "Soon he'll be running around, getting into everything. Then we'll need to baby-proof the barn," Lorraine said practically. "You know he'll want to be out there with you every minute. He can come out with me anytime. I'll teach him about ranching, same as my father taught me." They ate supper together, the 3 of them, and put Matthew to bed. Then they sat on the porch in the twilight, Morgan in the rocking chair he'd built and Lorraine on his lap, watching the stars come out over the Kansas prairie. "You ever regret it?" Lorraine asked quietly. "Sending for a mail-order bride, taking a chance on someone you'd never met," Not for a single second. Best decision I ever made. He kissed her temple, right over the scar. Do you regret coming here, marrying a stranger? Never. You saved my life, Morgan. Not just literally, but in every way that matters. You gave me a reason to believe in goodness again, to trust again, to love again. We saved each other, and they had. Two broken people, brought together by desperation and circumstance, who had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pains. A partnership based on respect, trust, and a love that grew stronger every day. Years passed, bringing more children. A daughter they named Clara after Morgan's mother arrived 2 years after Matthew. Then twin boys, Joseph and James, came 3 years after that. The ranch prospered, growing into one of the most successful operations in the county. Morgan and Lorraine worked side by side, raising their children with love and teaching them the value of hard work and kindness. Lorraine's scars never faded, but they never bothered her again. They were part of her story, part of what had brought her to Morgan. She wore them without shame, and her children grew up seeing them not as ugly marks but as symbols of their mother's strength and survival. The children adored their grandmother Catherine, who visited every summer and spoiled them terribly. She watched Lorraine's happiness with satisfaction, glad that her daughter had found such love and contentment after so much pain. In the town of Republic, Lorraine became known for her kindness and capability. She helped organize the church charity drives, taught reading to the children of new immigrants, and never turned away anyone in need. People forgot to see her scars after a while, seeing instead the warm-hearted woman who always had a kind word and a helping hand. Morgan continued to fall more in love with his wife with each passing year. He loved watching her with their children, loved the way she still blushed when he complimented her, loved growing old alongside her. Every night, he thanked God for the day the stagecoach had brought her into his life. One evening, nearly 20 years after their first meeting, Morgan and Lorraine sat on that same porch, now weathered and familiar. Their children were all asleep inside. The ranch was quiet and the stars were bright overhead. "You remember the day we met?" Morgan asked, his arm around Lorraine's shoulders. Her hair was streaked with gray now, and new lines had joined her scars, but she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. "I remember thinking you were going to send me back on the next stage," Lorraine admitted. "I was so scared, so certain that you'd take one look at my face and reject me. I took one look at your face and wanted to protect you from anyone who'd ever hurt you. You've done that and so much more." She leaned against him, comfortable and content. "You gave me a life I never thought I'd have. Children, a home, respect, love. Everything I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me just as much. You brought this house back to life. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to work hard and build something lasting." He kissed the top of her head. "I bought a bride sight unseen, expecting nothing more than help with the ranch. Instead, I got the love of my life. And I arrived scarred and broken, expecting nothing more than shelter. Instead, I got everything I'd ever dreamed of." They sat together in the peaceful darkness, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built a love that would last a lifetime. The scars that had once represented pain and loss now represented survival and strength. The ranch that had once been failing was now thriving. The loneliness that had once defined them both was long gone, replaced by the warmth of family and love. Matthew, now 18 and preparing to take over more responsibility on the ranch, looked like his father but had his mother's determination. Clara, 16, was beautiful and kind, utterly unconcerned with superficial things like scars or appearances. The twins, 13, were wild and energetic, keeping everyone on their toes. Their family was loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. One Sunday after church, as they all piled into the wagon for the ride home, Evelyn Martinez stopped them. "I was just telling the new minister about you too," she said with a warm smile. "About how you met and built such a beautiful life together. He said it sounded like a love story for the ages." Lorraine laughed, her scarred face crinkling with amusement. "It's just our story. Nothing special." But Morgan disagreed. "It's very special. It's a story about taking chances, about looking past surfaces to see what really matters, about building something real out of desperate circumstances." "It's a story about love conquering fear," Evelyn added. "And that's always special." As they drove home, the children chattering in the back of the wagon, Lorraine thought about how far she'd come from that terrified woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 2 decades ago. She'd been so certain that her life was over, that the scars on her face meant she'd never be loved or wanted. But Morgan had proven all her fears wrong. He'd looked at her scars and seen strength. He'd looked at her damaged face and seen beauty. He'd looked at a stranger and seen his future wife. And she'd looked at a desperate rancher and seen a kind heart. She'd looked at a failing ranch and seen potential. She'd looked at a man she didn't know and seen someone she could trust. Together, they'd built a love that was deep and true, a family that was strong and happy, and a life that was rich with meaning. The scars remained, visible reminders of pain survived and overcome. But they were no longer the most important thing about Lorraine. They were just one part of a complex, beautiful whole. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Morgan and Lorraine lay in their bed, holding each other close. "I love you," Morgan whispered into the darkness. "Every day I love you more." "I love you too," Lorraine replied. "Thank you for seeing past my scars. Thank you for seeing past my loneliness and desperation." He traced the familiar line of the scar on her face, his touch gentle and loving. "These scars brought you to me. How could I ever see them as anything but beautiful?" They made love slowly, tenderly, two people who knew each other completely and loved what they knew. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, they drifted off to sleep, content and secure in the life they'd built together. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and more prosperity. The ranch expanded further, becoming one of the largest in Kansas. Matthew married a sweet girl from Salina and gave Morgan and Lorraine 3 grandchildren. Clara married a banker from Republic and had 4 more. The twins both became ranchers themselves, settling on adjacent properties and starting their own families. Through it all, Morgan and Lorraine remained devoted to each other. They never spent a night apart unless absolutely necessary. They still held hands while walking. They still stole kisses in the kitchen when they thought no one was looking. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, talking about their day and watching the sunset. When Morgan turned 65, he finally turned over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Matthew, though he still helped with major decisions and enjoyed working with the horses. Lorraine, at 61, finally let Clara take over organizing the church charity drives, though she still contributed her time and skills. They were growing old together, exactly as they'd promised on their wedding day so many years ago. One spring morning, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Lorraine said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten on that stagecoach, if I'd been too afraid or too ashamed?" "I try not to think about it," Morgan admitted. "A life without you is too terrible to contemplate. I think about it sometimes, how close I came to giving up, to just accepting that my life was over at 23. She shook her head. "If I'd done that, I would have missed all of this. Our children, our grandchildren, our life together. I would have missed everything that matters. I'm glad you were brave enough to take the chance. I'm glad you were kind enough to give me one." Their eldest grandson, Morgan Matthew Everlie, named for his grandfather, ran up to the porch. At 8 years old, he was the image of his grandfather at that age. "Grandpa, will you teach me to rope?" he asked eagerly. "I suppose I could," Morgan said, setting down his coffee. "If your grandmother says it's all right." "Grandma!" The boy turned pleading eyes on Lorraine. She laughed. "Go on, but be careful, both of you." They watched Morgan and his grandson head toward the barn, the old man's hand on the young boy's shoulder, heads bent together as they talked. "He's so good with them," Clara said, coming up the porch steps with a basket of eggs. "Papa always did have a way with children." "He has a way with everyone," Lorraine said proudly. "Your father is the best man I've ever known. We're lucky to have him, and he's lucky to have you." Clara kissed her mother's scarred cheek. "I'm going to start breakfast, coming in a minute." Lorraine sat alone on the porch, watching her husband teach their grandson the skills he'd learned from his own father. The continuity of it, the tradition passing from generation to generation, filled her with a deep sense of satisfaction. She thought about the girl she'd been, stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but scars and fear. She thought about the woman she'd become, surrounded by love and family, respected in her community, content in her life. The journey from one to the other had been possible because of one man's kindness and one woman's courage. Morgan returned from the barn an hour later, finding Lorraine still on the porch, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling into his chair beside her. "Everything." "Nothing. How grateful I am." She took his weathered hand in her scarred one. "How much I love you. I love you too. Always have, always will." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd started as strangers brought together by desperation and had become each other's greatest blessing. The ranch bustled with activity around them, their family working and playing and living the life they'd built together. As the sun climbed higher in the Kansas sky, warming the prairie and bringing the promise of another beautiful day, Morgan and Lorraine Everlie held hands and counted their blessings. They had each other. They had their family. They had a life rich with love and meaning. They had taken the broken pieces of their separate lives and forged something beautiful and whole. And it had all started with a cowboy desperate enough to buy a bride sight unseen, and a scarred woman brave enough to take a chance on him. From those unlikely beginnings had grown a love story that would be told and retold in Republic for generations to come, a testament to the power of seeing past surfaces to the beauty beneath, of choosing courage over fear, of building love from the ashes of loss. Their story proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that real love sees not with the eyes but with the heart. Morgan had fallen harder than ever for his scarred bride, not despite her scars, but because of everything they represented. Her strength, her survival, her courage. And Lorraine had fallen just as hard for her cowboy husband, who'd shown her that true love accepts and celebrates every part of a person, the damaged parts and the whole parts alike. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love, family, and the knowledge that beauty comes in many forms, and that the deepest scars often mark the strongest souls. As evening fell and their children and grandchildren gathered for supper, filling the house with noise and laughter, Morgan and Lorraine looked at each other across the crowded table and smiled. They'd done well. They'd taken their broken pieces and made something whole. They'd loved each other through good times and hard times. They'd built a family, a ranch, and a life together, and they'd do it all again in a heartbeat, scars and all.